The rain cutting across the cracked asphalt of Oak Ridge Terraces was freezing, turning the metal stairwells into sheets of black ice. Juliana Sterling stood outside the door of apartment 4B, the silver transponder key heavy and cold in her palm. It was the master bypass key he had handed her 3 months ago during his onboarding, the one she had tossed into her desk drawer and forgotten. Assuming she would never have a reason to visit the world, he returned to every evening. Her gloved knuckles hovered over the faded wood, trembling slightly. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked the razor-sharp edge that usually commanded the boardrooms of Meridian Aerospace. "Are you still furious with me?" The door swung open with a low, heavy groan. Garrett Vance stood in the entryway, dressed in a faded, gray thermal shirt and dark canvas trousers. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with an exhausting, unbothered patience, his gaze like winter light passing through thick glass, distant, steady, and entirely devoid of malice. Behind him, a 6-year-old girl named Chloe sat on a small rug, clutching an old leather-bound pilot's logbook against her chest, her wide, observant eyes shifting between her father and the powerful woman at the door. When that logbook eventually opened, the entire trajectory of Meridian Aerospace would splinter. Not because of an explosive confession, but because of a quiet truth. Garrett had buried beneath years of deliberate obscurity, a silence the corporate elite had foolishly mistaken for compliance. 48 hours earlier, the climate control systems inside the executive penthouse of Meridian Aerospace had begun to fail, leaving the polished marble floors smelling faintly of scorched wiring and expensive upholstery. Outside, a bitter Virginia winter was settling over Blackwood Executive Airfield, burying the runways in thick, unforgiving snow. Inside, nobody looked at the weather. Juliana Sterling had been awake since dawn, her hair pulled back into a flawless, unyielding knot, her dark, tailored suit communicating absolute authority before she even uttered a syllable. At 36, she had built her life on a single philosophy. Warmth was a liability, a currency to be heavily rationed in a world designed to take advantage of vulnerability. The crisis had struck without warning, a catastrophic telemetry breach. Heavily restricted flight automation codes under negotiation for a multi-billion-dollar defense contract had been systematically extracted from the primary server. The board of directors had threatened to freeze operations by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, the Internal Security Division had produced a singular anomaly report pointing directly to the Fleet Routing Diagnostics Team. The name at the very top of the briefing was Garrett Vance. Garrett was 39, a quiet, low-level systems technician who had spent the last 4 years operating in the deep shadows of the hangar infrastructure. His performance metrics were perfectly adequate, never drawing attention, never demanding praise. He arrived precisely at 7:30 a.m. and departed at exactly 4:30 p.m. without a single minute of variation. The security audit flagged a massive data extraction initiated under his primary credentials at midnight on a Tuesday, pulling proprietary encryption matrices he had no corporate authority to touch. Juliana had summoned the entire operational elite to the glass-walled command center overlooking Hangar 9. 12 senior executives sat around the perimeter of the mahogany table, their expressions tight with corporate panic. Garrett sat at the far end, his chair pushed slightly back toward the heavy glass exit. Preston Caldwell, the arrogant senior vice president of operations, tossed the printed audit trail across the polished wood, the paper sliding until it tapped against Garrett's calloused knuckles. "The digital footprint is absolute," Preston announced, his voice booming with theatrical indignation. "Someone used your Tier 4 clearance to bypass the flight control security perimeter." "This isn't just an operational error, Vance. This is corporate espionage. You had the access, you had the system window, and you have absolutely no alibi for that timeline." Juliana watched Garrett closely, expecting the standard defensive posture, the anger, the desperate pleas of innocence, the frantic sweating of a man facing ruin. Instead, Garrett remained entirely still, his large hands resting flat on the table. He looked past Preston, his eyes tracing the silhouette of an experimental business jet parked down in the dimly lit hangar below. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant calm that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. "I understand," Garrett said simply. A heavy, uncomfortable silence descended upon the command center. Executives exchanged rapid, uneasy glances. Preston slammed his palm against the table, infuriated by the lack of theater. "You understand?" Preston sneered. "That's your defense? You're being accused of compromising national defense infrastructure, and you have nothing else to say?" Garrett stood up, buttoning his weathered canvas jacket with slow, methodical movements. He didn't look at Preston. He looked directly at Juliana, his steady gaze holding hers for 3 agonizing seconds. "My shift ended 10 minutes ago," Garrett said quietly, checking his plain black wristwatch. "My daughter is waiting at the bus stop." Without waiting for a dismissal, he turned and walked out of the command center, his boots clicking in a slow, unhurried rhythm against the hardwood floor. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind him, leaving the executive board stranded in a vacuum of his making. Juliana stood by the window, watching his lone figure walk out into the swirling white canvas of the airfield, his shoulders squared against the freezing wind. He didn't fight, she thought, a strange, cold knot tightening in her chest. A guilty man bargains, a desperate man pleads. But Garrett Vance had simply walked out into the storm, leaving them with a narrative that suddenly felt entirely too simple to be true. The digital forensics report sat on Juliana's desk under the harsh luminescence of a single desk lamp. It was nearly midnight, and the expansive executive floor of Meridian Aerospace was entirely vacant, a labyrinth of dark glass and silent terminals. Everyone else had gone home, satisfied with the easy narrative Preston Caldwell had constructed. A low-level technician commits high-level theft, freezes under questioning, and walks out. It was clean. It was convenient. But Juliana couldn't shake the unsettling rhythm of Garrett Vance's exit. She summoned her trusted senior systems analyst, Leo Channing, a meticulous man who had survived 3 corporate restructurings by relying strictly on verifiable data. He stood across from her desk, rubbing his tired eyes, holding a decrypted tablet. "Run me through the telemetry access again, Leo," Juliana commanded, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of the building's backup generators. "And don't give me Preston's summary. Give me the raw system logs." Leo tapped the screen, projecting a cascade of amber code onto the glass partition behind them. "That's where it gets problematic, Miss Sterling." The login sequence definitely utilized Garrett Vance's security tokens. It bypassed the primary firewall at exactly 12:04 a.m. on Tuesday. But the physical terminal footprint didn't originate from Hangar 9, nor did it come from his registered home IP address. Juliana leaned forward, her silver pen hovering inches above the desk. "Explain." The request was routed through an unmapped virtual private network using an obsolete hard-coded administrative protocol. Leo explained, his brow furrowing. "A Tier 4 technician shouldn't even know this protocol exists. It hasn't been used in our active deployment architecture for nearly a decade. Furthermore, the workstation data reveals that Garrett's actual, physically assigned computer in the hangar maintenance bay was completely powered down at 4:32 p.m. that evening. Someone used his credentials from an outside source, using a back door that shouldn't be there." Juliana stood up, walking slowly to the sweeping window that overlooked the frozen airfield. Down below, the lights of Hangar 9 flickered through the falling snow. So either Garrett Vance is a highly sophisticated cyber operator hiding disguised as a grease monkey technician, or someone went to immense trouble to make it look like he is. "There's one more thing," Leo added quietly. "The specific telemetry files that were extracted, they weren't just the active defense contracts. Whoever pulled them went deep into the master foundational source code of our entire flight automation engine. That's data buried 3 layers deeper than the standard client repositories. To find it, you'd need an exact architectural map of the system's birth." While Juliana stared out into the dark, miles away in the weathered neighborhood of Oak Ridge Terraces, the atmosphere was entirely different. Inside apartment 4B, the air smelled of simmering vegetable soup and toasted bread. A small rhythmic ticking came from the old radiator in the corner, a steady sound that had defined the cadence of Garrett's evenings for the last 4 years. The apartment was modest, populated by walls of heavily creased technical manuals, historical aviation biographies, and framed sketches of early aerospace designs. At the small kitchen table, Chloe was meticulously coloring a drawing of a massive, multi-engine cargo plane. One leg of the wooden table was slightly shorter than the rest, stabilized by a neatly folded piece of cardboard Garrett had placed there years ago. Garrett stepped away from the stove, setting down 2 ceramic bowls with the practiced, gentle grace of a man whose large frame belied an absolute tenderness. He sat down across from his daughter, his expression completely clearing of the tension from the afternoon boardroom confrontation. When he was with Chloe, the corporate storms of Meridian Aerospace ceased to exist. "Dad?" Chloe asked, pausing her green crayon mid-stroke. "Did the big planes fly today in the snow?" "A few of them did, sweetheart," Garrett said softly, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "The heavy transports with the specialized de-icing rigs." They don't mind the cold as much as the smaller ones. Did you fix them? Garrett smiled, a genuine, warm expression that none of his corporate superiors had ever witnessed. I kept an eye on them. Make sure you eat your soup before it gets cold. Chloe took a spoonful, then looked toward the small bookshelf near the hallway where the old leather-bound pilot's logbook rested. Are we going to read from Mom's book tonight? A brief, quiet shadow passed over Garrett's eyes, a fleeting moment of profound sorrow that he instantly mastered with a gentle smile. We can read 2 pages tonight. But only if you finish your dinner and get your teeth brushed without a reminder. Deal, she chirped, instantly re-engaging with her meal. Garrett sat back, his eyes drifting toward his canvas jacket hanging by the door. Inside the breast pocket was his suspended security badge. He knew what they were saying about him at the facility. He knew Preston Caldwell was already drafting the formal termination paperwork, preparing to hand his life over to the federal investigators to protect the company's stock value. He had seen the look of cold calculation in Juliana Sterling's eyes, the look of a CEO who saw human beings as variables in an equation. He didn't care about the corporate politics. He didn't care about the wealth or the prestige, but they had threatened the quiet life he had built for Chloe. They had dragged his name into the mud of their own corrupt making. The next morning, the confrontation escalated. Juliana had barely stepped into the executive suite when Preston Caldwell intercepted her, flanked by 2 armed private security officers. I've already contacted the federal authorities, Juliana, Preston announced, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. Vance didn't show up for his mandatory internal review this morning. He's running. I'm authorizing security to seize his personal locker in Hangar 9 and hand everything over to the marshals. We need to clear this cancer out of our infrastructure before the board meeting at noon. Juliana stopped dead in the hallway, her icy gaze locking onto Preston. The arrogance radiating from her vice president was suffocating, but beneath it, she caught a flicker of something else, an unnatural urgency. We wait, Preston. Juliana said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The forensic audit isn't complete. The data says he's guilty, Preston shot back, stepping into her personal space, his public composure cracking slightly. Are you going to risk a $5 billion defense contract because you have a soft spot for a low-level mechanic who can't even look us in the eye? Juliana didn't flinch. She noted the subtle tremor in Preston's left hand, the way he kept glancing toward the main server room access corridor. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, and for the first time in her career, she realized the real threat wasn't lurking at the bottom of her organization. It was standing right in front of her. The heavy steel doors of Hangar 9 rumbled violently as a sudden gust of freezing wind swept across Blackwood Airfield, forcing the automated guide tracks to hiss under the sudden strain. Inside, the morning shift of mechanics and grid technicians stood in a rigid, uncomfortable semicircle. Preston Caldwell stood at the center of the bay, his expensive cashmere overcoat contrasting sharply with the oil-stained concrete. Behind him, a security officer held a pair of heavy bolt cutters, the hardened steel jaws resting against the padlocked latch of Garrett Vance's personal equipment locker. Cut it, Preston ordered, his voice echoing off the high, corrugated ceiling. Stand down. The command was not loud, but it possessed the absolute clarity of an execution order. Juliana Sterling stepped out of the glass-walled hangar elevator, her dark wool coat trailing slightly behind her. Her eyes swept over the gathered mechanics, noting the tight, protective expressions on their faces. These men didn't respect Preston's title, but they respected the quiet man who usually worked beside them. Preston turned, a thin, dismissive smile tight on his lips. Juliana, we're securing the perimeter of the breach. This locker belongs to a suspended employee who is currently refusing to answer corporate summons. It is fully within my operational authority to check for compromised storage media. I said stand down, Preston, Juliana repeated, walking directly into the center of the bay until she was inches from him. The mechanics watched in breathless silence, the emotional tension thick enough to obscure the roar of a running turbine outside. If a single piece of personal property is touched without my explicit sign-off, you will be escorted from this facility by airport police before noon. Am I making myself clear? Preston's smile vanished, his eyes darkening. He gestured to the security guard who slowly lowered the bolt cutters. You're exposed on this, Juliana. The board wants a scapegoat, and you're protecting a ghost. Juliana didn't answer him. She walked past him, her hand reaching into her pocket to pull out the silver transponder key Garrett had given her months ago, the master administrative key that unlocked every specialized station under his purview. She inserted it into the digital bypass lock beside the physical padlock. The indicator light flickered from red to deep amber, and with a soft pneumatic hiss, the inner security panel of the locker slid open. Preston leaned in instantly, expecting to find encrypted drives or printouts of national defense contracts. Instead, the locker contained a perfectly organized arrangement of standard tools, a pair of worn leather flight gloves, and a single, pristine, steel-bound technical binder buried beneath a neatly folded canvas jacket. Juliana reached in and pulled the binder out. It was heavy, its metal edges scuffed from years of handling. She opened the cover page. Preston scoffed, glancing over her shoulder. "Just an old system manual," Preston muttered, turning away to hide his frustration. A waste of time. But Juliana's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes scanned the handwritten schematics in the margins, flawless, geometric annotations drawn with mathematical precision. The ink had faded to a dull sepia, but the structural elegance of the logic was unmistakable. It was the foundational source code of Meridian's entire flight automation engine. But the date stamped at the bottom of the page was 2016. Meridian Aerospace hadn't even acquired the patent until 2020. At the bottom right of the title block, written in a steady, unhurried script, were the names of the original creators. G. Vance. E. Vance. Juliana closed the binder with a sharp snap, her heart hammering against her ribs. Garrett Vance wasn't just a low-level technician maintaining their systems. He was the ghost architect who had breathed life into the very technology that made Meridian a multi-billion-dollar empire. And he had been working for a mechanic's wage, letting the world believe he was completely ordinary. She turned on her heel, ignoring Preston's demands for an explanation, and walked straight back to the elevator. She had spent years believing that success was measured by the height of an office tower, but she was starting to realize she had built her entire career on a foundation she didn't even understand. By 7:30 that evening, the freezing rain had turned the roads into treacherous black ice. Juliana drove herself to Oak Ridge Terraces, leaving her corporate security detail behind. She stood outside the worn door of apartment 4B, the cold bleeding through her leather gloves as she knocked. When Garrett opened the door, the warmth of the small apartment spilled into the drafty hallway, carrying the scent of simmering cedarwood and toasted bread. He looked at the heavy steel binder tucked under her arm, his expression remaining entirely level, entirely unbothered. "Are you still furious with me?" Juliana asked, her voice dropping to a vulnerable whisper she hadn't used in a decade. Garrett stepped back, clearing a path into the small, neatly kept living room. "Furious requires energy, Miss Sterling. I don't have much to spare after a full shift and a spelling test." Chloe was sitting on the small rug near the radiator, her crayons scattered around her. When she saw Juliana, she didn't run or hide. She simply stood up, holding a small, battered wooden box with a brass clasp. She walked over to Juliana with the absolute, unself-conscious confidence that only comes from a child who feels completely safe in her father's shadow. "You look cold," Chloe said, looking up with her wide, serious eyes. "We have peppermint tea. Dad makes it when the weather gets bad." Juliana looked down at the little girl, then at Garrett, who was already moving toward the stove with the quiet, steady masculinity that seemed to completely anchor the room. In the boardroom, Juliana held all the power, all the money, all the leverage. But standing in this small, uneven room, watching a father quietly comfort his daughter with nothing more than his presence, she felt a profound, aching realization. She had everything the corporate world could offer, but she didn't have peace. And this man, whom she had publicly humiliated 24 hours earlier, gave safety to everyone around him without even trying. Juliana sat at the uneven wooden table, her fingers tracing the faded silver lettering on the edge of the master technical binder. The warmth of the peppermint tea radiated through her porcelain mug, but her inside felt entirely frozen. Across from her, Garrett set down a small plate of simple biscuits for Chloe, his large frame moving with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed to shrink the small kitchen. "G. Vance. E. Vance," Juliana said, her voice breaking the quiet hum of the apartment's radiator. She looked up, her gaze locking onto his steady gray eyes. "You didn't just maintain the system, Garrett. You and your wife built the entire foundational matrix of Meridian Aerospace. Why is your name not on a single patent in our headquarters?" Garrett sat down, his hands resting flat on the table. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had long ago categorized his grief and put it away where it couldn't hurt the people he loved. 8 years ago, it wasn't Meridian Aerospace, Garrett said, his voice a low, calm rumble. It was just a three-person operation in a rented warehouse near the Eastern Shore. Me, my wife Elena, and an early investor who promised to handle the capital while we handled the mathematics. Elena was the true genius. She designed the primary distribution algorithm while she was pregnant with Chloe. He paused, his eyes drifting to Chloe, who was carefully stacking her crayons by color. When Chloe was 2, Elena got sick. Garrett continued softly. The aggressive kind. The kind that doesn't give you time to negotiate. At the same time, our investor brought in a new management consultant to restructure the equity. That consultant was Preston Caldwell. He realized we hadn't finalized the secondary patent filings. He structured a legal freeze that would have taken 5 years of courtroom warfare to untangle. Juliana felt a sickening weight drop into her stomach. And you didn't fight him. Elena had 6 months left, Garrett said, looking directly at Juliana, his expression completely devoid of resentment. I had a choice. I could spend those 6 months in a wood-paneled courtroom fighting predatory executives for a percentage of a company, or I could spend every single hour holding my wife's hand and watching my daughter learn to walk. I chose my family, Miss Sterling. I let them have the name. I let them have the empire. Chloe walked over, sensing the sudden drop in the room's emotional gravity. She slid her small hand into Garrett's massive palm, leaning her head against his shoulder. Mom said the planes we built would always know the way home, she whispered to Juliana. That's why Dad keeps the box. Before Juliana could respond, the heavy silence of the room was shattered by the violent, high-pitched vibration of her corporate phone against the wooden table. The caller ID flashed with Leo Channing's name. She snapped the phone to her ear. Leo, what is it? Juliana, you need to get back to the facility right now. Leo's voice was fractured with raw, unadulterated panic. The sound of screaming sirens and automated alarms bled through the speaker. Preston didn't wait for the morning. He brought in an outside cybersecurity firm to force a brute force decryption override on the Hangar 9 mainframes. He wanted to pull what he called hidden proof of Garrett's treason before the board convened. Juliana stood up so fast her chair scraped violently against the floor. What did he do, Leo? The outside firm didn't understand the legacy core architecture, Leo shouted over a sudden, deafening mechanical roar in the background. They triggered an automated safety lockdown. The main hangar's experimental propulsion testing grid, the one loaded with 20,000 gallons of pressurized aviation fuel for tomorrow's defense showcase, has completely frozen its release valves. The automated safety systems are blind. The cooling loops are shutting down, and the pressure in the storage manifolds is climbing exponentially. The system thinks it's under a cyber attack and has locked the heavy blast doors from the inside. There are 3 night shift technicians trapped in the telemetry bay. Juliana's blood ran cold. Override the lockdown from the primary terminal. We can't, Leo cried out, his voice cracking. The brute force script corrupted the administrative access loop. The system isn't responding to any modern Meridian protocol. In 12 minutes, the manifold pressure will breach the critical threshold. It will take out Hangar 9 and half the runway infrastructure. Juliana lowered the phone, her face pale, her hands trembling. She looked at the multi-billion-dollar empire she ran, suddenly realizing that all her wealth, all her corporate power, and all her authority couldn't open a single door or save a single life. She was completely, utterly helpless. Garrett stood up slowly. The easy, gentle warmth that had defined him seconds ago vanished, replaced by a terrifying, absolute focus. He didn't panic. He didn't ask questions. He simply closed the steel binder on the table, slipped it under his arm, and looked down at his daughter. Chloe, sweetheart, Garrett said, his voice perfectly level, a steady anchor in the middle of the breaking storm. I need you to stay here with Mrs. Higgins from next door for a little while. Dad has to go take care of a heavy transport. Chloe looked at his eyes, saw the absolute certainty there, and nodded softly. Okay, Dad, make sure it flies straight. Garrett turned to Juliana, his large shoulders squared, his quiet masculinity radiating an immense, undeniable authority that made her corporate title feel entirely insignificant. Get in the car, Miss Sterling, Garrett said quietly. We have 11 minutes. The sleek black SUV cut through the blinding sheets of freezing rain, its tires fighting for traction on the slick Virginia highway. Juliana sat in the passenger seat, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were translucent. The dashboard clock illuminated the shrinking window of time, 9 minutes. Her phone was a constant, vibrating nightmare in her palm, buzzing with frantic notifications from the airfield security division. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was a woman who owned the sky, yet right now, The ground felt like it was dissolving beneath her feet. She looked across the console. Garrett drove with a terrifying, absolute stillness. His large hands held the steering wheel with steady, unhurried pressure, his eyes tracking the dark, icy road ahead through the sweeping rhythm of the wipers. There was no sweat on his brow, no frantic shifting in his seat. "We aren't going to make it," Juliana whispered, her voice fracturing as she stared at a fresh notification. The security perimeter around Hangar 9 has completely locked down the secondary access roads. They're evacuating the administrative towers. Preston has entirely lost control. Garrett didn't look at her, but his voice was a low, solid vibration that instantly filled the cabin, pushing back against her rising panic. "Take a deep breath, Miss Sterling. Panic changes your breathing, but it doesn't change the countdown. We're going through the commercial freight gate. It bypasses the primary security grid. That gate has been sealed since the winter storm started," she said, her chest tight. "I fixed the pneumatic actuator on that gate 3 weeks ago," Garrett replied smoothly, his tone entirely matter-of-fact. "It works." When the SUV roared past the darkened perimeter of Blackwood Executive Airfield, the true scale of the disaster became visible. The night sky above Hangar 9 was illuminated by the violent rotating amber pulses of emergency beacons. High-decibel sirens wailed through the freezing air, their mechanical shrieks swallowed by the howling wind. They slid to a halt near the maintenance entrance. Juliana threw the door open, the sub-zero wind slapping her face, but she barely felt it. She ran toward the command annex, Garrett walking a half-step behind her, carrying the heavy steel binder like a weapon of absolute precision. Inside the technical bunker overlooking the hangar floor, the scene was pure, unadulterated chaos. 20 monitors flashed with crimson warning banners. A team of outside cybersecurity contractors in matching black polo shirts were frantically typing on keyboards, shouting over one another as automated alarms blared from the ceiling. Preston Caldwell stood at the center of the room, his expensive silk tie undone, sweat staining the collar of his shirt. He was pale, his eyes wide with the hollow, desperate terror of a man who had pulled a thread and accidentally unraveled the world. "It's not responding," one of the contractors screamed, slamming his hands onto the desk. "The Legacy Core has entered a thermal runaway protection loop. It's venting pressure from the wrong manifolds. We have less than 5 minutes before the secondary storage tanks fracture." Preston turned, spotting Juliana as she burst through the glass doors. He lunged toward her, his voice cracking with defensive rage. "Juliana, thank God. Your low-level mechanic Vance, his encrypted backdoors, did this. He programmed a dead man's switch into the system to sabotage us." Preston stopped dead as Garrett stepped into the room behind her. The sheer physical presence of the man, combined with the cold, absolute authority in his expression, made the vice president instinctively take a step backward. "Shut up, Preston," Juliana said, her voice completely stripped of its usual corporate restraint. It was a raw, commanding slice of anger. She turned to the contractors. "Get away from the terminals." The lead contractor didn't move, staring at Garrett's grease-stained canvas jacket. "Who the hell is this?" "We're running a Tier 1 military-grade decryption protocol. A mechanic can't." Garrett didn't wait for him to finish. He walked straight to the primary terminal, his large hand reaching out to grab the back of the contractor's ergonomic chair, pulling it backward with a single, effortless motion that cleared the workspace. He set the heavy steel binder down on the console with a definitive thud. The room fell instantly silent, save for the screaming sirens. The sheer weight of Garrett's quiet masculinity took over the space. He didn't look at Preston. He didn't look at the flashing red alarms. He looked at the scrolling lines of amber code on the central monitor, his eyes tracking the data with the familiar ease of a father reading a bedtime story. The brute force script didn't just lock the system, Garrett announced, his voice cool, steady, and entirely dominant. It severed the connection between the digital logic gates and the physical hydraulic valves. The system thinks the fuel lines are empty, so it's keeping the pressure valves closed to prevent a vacuum collapse. "We know that," Preston shouted, his voice trembling as he checked his watch. But the blast doors are sealed with 3,000 pounds of pneumatic pressure. The technicians are trapped on the other side, and the mainframe is completely dead to our commands. It's an impossible loop. Garrett opened the steel binder. He didn't look at the technical drawings. He looked directly at Juliana, his gaze a grounded anchor in the sea of her terror. "It's only impossible if you think the machine is smarter than the person who built it," Garrett said softly. He reached down into his pocket and pulled out the old silver transponder key. Miss Sterling, I need you to stand at the manual emergency release lever by the glass partition. When I tell you to pull it, don't hesitate. If you hesitate by 2 seconds, the pressure feedback will shatter the glass. Juliana looked at her hands, which were still shaking. She looked at the man who had nothing but his dignity and his daughter, and she realized she trusted him more than she had ever trusted anyone in her entire life. She walked to the lever, her fingers wrapping around the cold iron handle. Garrett turned back to the terminal, his fingers hovering over the vintage mechanical keyboard. He didn't look like a mechanic anymore, he looked like a commander directing a fleet. He struck the first key, and the entire mainframe groaned. The rhythmic, heavy clacking of the vintage mechanical keyboard cut through the high-pitched shriek of the emergency sirens like a steady pulse. Garrett's large fingers moved across the keys with a terrifying, fluid precision that left the room completely paralyzed. Lines of raw emerald green code began to cascade down the central monitor, aggressively overwriting the crimson warning banners that Preston's contractors had been fighting for hours. The lead cybersecurity contractor stepped closer, his jaw dropping as he stared at the scrolling text. What is he doing? That's a deep kernel architectural override. The modern system documentation doesn't even list those command directories. It's restricted by a double-blind encryption matrix. It's only double-blind if you bought the system from a broker, Garrett said, his voice dropping into a register of cool, absolute command that made the entire room feel insignificant. He didn't break his typing cadence for a single second. The secondary exception matrix doesn't look at the corporate security protocols. It looks at the hardware's manufacturing signature. Preston Caldwell stepped forward, his face a grotesque mask of sweat and panic. Vance, step away from that console. You are committing a federal offense. You're manipulating proprietary data. Garrett stopped typing. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and charged with an explosive tension. He turned his head slowly, his piercing gray eyes locking onto Preston. The sheer physical authority radiating from Garrett's quiet masculinity made the senior vice president instinctively freeze in his tracks. I am manipulating my own data, Preston, Garrett said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Elena and I wrote this exception loop in a freezing warehouse while you were still trying to figure out how to leverage stock options. You didn't understand the machine when you stole it 8 years ago, and you don't understand it now. The revelation hit the bunker like a physical shockwave. The cybersecurity contractors stopped talking completely, their eyes darting from Garrett's oil-stained canvas jacket to the sweeping lines of foundational code on the monitors. Leo Channing let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years, a profound look of awe washing over his face. Juliana stood by the iron handle of the emergency release lever, her eyes fixed on the man she had so deeply underestimated. The corporate armor she had spent her entire adult life constructing felt completely useless. This man didn't have a title, he didn't have an executive office, and he didn't care about her billion-dollar evaluation. Yet, he held the life of her company, and the lives of her men, in his calloused hands. Miss Sterling, Garrett called out, his voice sharp and focused. The pneumatic bypass is aligned. Pull the lever now. Juliana didn't hesitate. She threw her entire weight against the iron handle, pulling it downward. A deafening metallic roar echoed through the concrete foundations of Hangar 9. The pressurized aviation fuel lines groaned violently as the automated relief valves finally snapped open, venting the volatile gases away from the main storage tanks and out through the external roof stacks. The blinding crimson alarms on the ceiling flickered once, twice, and then transitioned into a soothing, cool blue. The heavy, 3-ton automated blast doors at the back of the hangar ground open with a massive pneumatic hiss. Through the thick observation glass, Juliana watched as the 3 trapped night shift technicians stumbled out into the main bay, coughing from the vapor but completely uninjured. Leo Channing immediately radios the medical team down on the floor, his voice cracking with immense relief. Down in the hangar, word traveled with the speed of an electrical current. Dozens of mechanics, fuel specialists, and safety personnel who had refused to evacuate had gathered around the perimeter of the technical bunker. Through the glass walls, they watched the entire sequence play out. They saw the arrogant corporate contractors standing helplessly in the corners. They saw Preston Caldwell trembling, looking small and utterly broken. And they saw Garrett Vance standing at the master terminal, his posture relaxed, his quiet strength anchoring the entire facility. The mechanics down on the floor didn't look at him as a low-level systems technician anymore. They looked at him with a profound, quiet reverence. He was the ghost in their machine, the hidden giant who had just saved their lives while the corporate elite panicked in their tailored suits. Preston tried to recover, his voice rising in a desperate, shrill attempt to salvage his authority. "This doesn't change the audit trail, Juliana. He still had the access tokens on Tuesday night. He's the one who initiated the original telemetry leak to our competitors. He orchestrated this whole crisis to look like a hero." Juliana walked away from the emergency lever, her boots striking the floor with a slow, deliberate finality. She stood between Preston and Garrett, her gaze cutting into her vice president like a blade of ice. "The audit trail is complete, Preston," Juliana said, her voice echoing clearly across the silent bunker. "Leo Channing finalized the physical terminal verification while I was on my way here. The unauthorized login on Tuesday night didn't come from Garrett's terminal. It came from an encrypted laptop registered to an offshore shell company. A company whose primary executive credit line is directly tied to your personal banking signature." Preston's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in his ruined cashmere coat. "You didn't want to find a scapegoat, Preston," Juliana continued, her voice filled with a cold, unforgiving disgust. "You wanted to bury the only man alive who could look at a line of stolen code and recognize your handwriting. You are done." She turned her back on him, completely dismissing his existence, and looked at Garrett. The silence between them was long, filled with an unsaid understanding that went far deeper than any corporate apology could ever reach. Two airport police officers stepped into the technical bunker, their heavy boots clicking against the linoleum floor. Juliana gave a single, imperceptible nod. The officers flanked Preston Caldwell, whose hands were trembling so violently he could barely keep them in his pockets. He opened his mouth to deliver one final, desperate corporate threat, but as his eyes met the cold, unyielding wall of Garrett's gaze, the words died in his throat. He looked small, hollowed out by his own greed, as he was marched out of the room. The outside cybersecurity contractors scrambled to pack their proprietary hardware into plastic cases, slinking out of the bunker without looking up from the floor. The room finally emptied, leaving only Juliana, Garrett, and Leo Channing. The automated systems hummed in their new stable blue rhythm, a peaceful ambient light reflecting off the glass partitions. Garrett slowly closed the heavy steel binder. He didn't celebrate. He didn't let out a sigh of relief. He simply slipped his old silver transponder key back into his pocket and turned away from the multi-billion-dollar mainframe, as if it were nothing more than a broken lawnmower he had successfully restarted. "We need to log the secondary audit trail into the formal system, Leo," Garrett said, his voice dropping back into that familiar, low, conversational rumble. "Make sure the federal investigators get the unredacted files from 2016, the ones with Elena's digital signature." "I'll handle it personally, Garrett," Leo said, his voice thick with a profound, unscripted reverence. He looked at the older man not as a superior looks at a subordinate, but as a student looks at a legendary master. "Everything is preserved. Nobody will ever erase your name from this infrastructure again." Garrett nodded once, then picked up his weathered canvas jacket from the back of the chair. When he stepped out of the glass bunker onto the elevated steel catwalk overlooking the main hangar floor, the ambient noise of the facility had died down completely. Down below, nearly 50 mechanics, fuelers, and structural technicians stood in the vast, brightly lit bay. They had watched the entire crisis unfold through the glass. They had seen the fire trucks standing by, they had heard the sirens, and they knew exactly who had stayed behind to pull the trapped night shift workers from the telemetry bay. As Garrett reached the top of the stairs, an older master mechanic named Thomas took off his grease-stained cap, holding it against his chest. One by one, every man on the hangar floor followed suit. There was no theatrical applause, no loud corporate cheering. It was a silent, powerful working man's salute, a collective acknowledgement of a man who possessed a quiet masculinity and a strength that money could never buy. Garrett stopped on the catwalk. He didn't wave, and he didn't give a speech. He simply placed his right hand over his heart, offering his men a single, deep nod of absolute mutual respect before continuing down the stairs. Juliana followed a few paces behind him, watching the scene with a tightening in her throat. She had spent her entire adult career believing that authority was derived from the height of an office building, from the sharpness of a tailored suit, or from the number of zeros on a balance sheet. But watching the absolute devotion this man commanded while wearing a faded thermal shirt and work boots, she realized she had been entirely blind. She had built an empire, but she had never built a home. When they reached the exit, The freezing rain had finally stopped, leaving the airfield shrouded in a quiet, silver winter mist. Juliana reached for her keys, her fingers shaking so badly they slipped from her grasp, the metal clicking against the wet asphalt. Before she could bend down, Garrett's large hand swept down, retrieving the keys. He looked at her face, noting the pale exhaustion under her eyes, the subtle trembling of her lips. The cold corporate executive had vanished, leaving behind a woman who was suddenly deeply human. "I'll drive, Miss Sterling," Garrett said softly, his voice a steady, grounding anchor in the freezing air. "You've had a long night." She didn't argue. She let him guide her to the passenger side, the simple act of him opening the door for her feeling less like a corporate courtesy and more like a protective shield. The drive back to Oak Ridge Terraces was completely silent, but it was a silence thick with a new, heavy awareness. Juliana watched his profile against the faint amber glow of the dashboard lights. He drove with the same calm, unhurried precision he brought to everything else. In her world, everyone was always frantic, always chasing the next percentage point, always projecting power to hide their terror. But Garrett Vance didn't need to project anything. His strength was a physical reality, a solid foundation that simply existed. When they reached apartment 4B, the morning light was just beginning to crack through the gray clouds, painting the worn wooden steps in shades of pale blue. Garrett unlocked the door quietly. Inside, the apartment was warm and perfectly still. Mrs. Higgins, the elderly neighbor from next door, was fast asleep on the small armchair, an open knitting basket resting in her lap. Garrett walked past her into the small bedroom. Juliana stood at the threshold, watching through the cracked door. Chloe was fast asleep, her small face pressed against the pillow, her arm wrapped tightly around her stuffed rabbit. Her other hand rested gently on the old wooden box with the brass clasp. Garrett knelt beside the bed, his massive frame making the child's room look impossibly small. He gently pulled the blanket up over Chloe's shoulders, his large, rough fingers moving with an exquisite tenderness as he smoothed down her hair. He stayed there for a long moment, just breathing in her presence, his shoulders dropping as the last of the hanger's tension left his body. He stepped back out into the living room, quietly waking Mrs. Higgins, sliding a crisp bill into her hand and thanking her with a whispered phrase. The old woman smiled, patted his arm, and slipped out into the hallway. The apartment settled into a deep domestic quiet, broken only by the rhythmic, familiar clicking of the radiator in the corner. Juliana stood near the small kitchen table, feeling entirely out of place in her expensive ruined suit, yet completely unable to tear herself away from the warmth of the room. Garrett stepped into the kitchen, turned on the small stove, and began preparing a fresh pot of tea. He didn't ask her if she wanted any, he simply knew she needed it. When he set the ceramic mug down in front of her, their fingers brushed briefly. The contrast was absolute, her cold, smooth hand against his warm, calloused skin, and a sudden electric stillness flashed through the small kitchen. Juliana looked down at the steaming mug, her controlled exterior finally cracking. A single quiet tear escaped her eye, tracking down her cheek before she could stop it. "I almost destroyed everything," she whispered, her voice fracturing completely as she looked up into his steady gray eyes. "Not just the technology. I took your name, I let Preston humiliate you in front of your peers, and I almost took away the quiet life you built for your daughter. I am so deeply sorry, Garrett." Garrett didn't step back. He stood right beside the wooden table, his massive presence radiating a warm, comforting security that seemed to envelop her entirely. "You didn't destroy anything, Juliana," he said, using her first name for the very first time. His voice was incredibly gentle, a low, masculine comfort that made her feel safe for the first time in years. "You looked for the truth when the crisis hit. Most people in your position would have accepted the easy lie to protect their evaluation. You didn't. You stood in the bay and you pulled the lever." She looked up at him, her breath catching. The space between them felt heavy, charged with a rare, genuine emotional chemistry that had nothing to do with corporate power and everything to do with two souls recognizing a profound alignment. She saw the quiet strength in his face, the absolute lack of bitterness, and for the first time in her life, Juliana Sterling realized that everything she had been running away from was standing right in front of her, holding a cup of tea. The corporate transition over the next fortnight was swift and merciless. The legal department of Meridian Aerospace, acting under the direct, unyielding command of Juliana Sterling, filed a comprehensive, unredacted disclosure with the federal authorities. Preston Caldwell's name was stripped from the building's glass directory before his first bail hearing. Every file, every line of legacy code, and every hidden transaction routing back to his offshore shell accounts was handed over to a specialized forensic task force. The narrative that had stood for 8 years, the lie that had built a multi-billion-dollar empire on the backs of ghost architects, collapsed within 48 hours. But the true correction didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened on a crisp Tuesday morning in the grand auditorium of the Blackwood Flight Facility. Juliana stood at the mahogany podium, looking out at an audience of over 500 employees. The full board of directors sat in the front row, their expressions subdued, their corporate arrogance entirely replaced by an uneasy compliance. Every mechanic from Hangar 9 was there, sitting in the back rows with their sleeves rolled up, their presence a solid, watchful wall of blue-collar pride. Meridian Aerospace was built on a story we did not bother to read properly. Juliana announced, her voice echoing through the massive space with absolute, unshakable clarity. She didn't use a script. She didn't look at the teleprompter. She looked directly at the back of the room. For 8 years, this institution has profited off an automation framework that was stolen from its true creators. We attributed greatness to men who merely knew how to manipulate balance sheets, while the actual genius remained in our shadows, fixing our landing gear and saving our lives. She clicked a remote, and the massive projection screen behind her illuminated. It didn't show stock trends or corporate growth charts. It showed a beautifully scanned, high-resolution image of the 2016 technical manual cover page. Below it, the digital signatures of Garrett Vance and Elena Vance were displayed for all to see. By unanimous decree of the board, Juliana continued, her voice softening slightly but retaining its immense authority, the foundational patents of this company have been legally and permanently amended. The Vance automation engine is now the official, registered core of our fleet infrastructure. Furthermore, a retroactive equity trust has been established, ensuring that the legacy of Elena Vance is preserved and that her daughter's future is entirely ironclad. A heavy silence gripped the auditorium, followed by a sudden rhythmic movement in the back. Thomas, the master mechanic, stood up. He didn't say a word, but he began a steady, heavy applause. Within 5 seconds, the entire hangar workforce joined him. The sound grew, a deafening thunder of respect that rattled the glass fixtures of the auditorium, forcing the board of directors to slowly stand and join the ovation. Garrett Vance was not in the auditorium to see it. He was at the small kitchen table in apartment 4B, carefully slicing a fresh apple into perfect, even wedges for Chloe's school lunchbox. The morning sun was streaming through the window, catching the golden dust motes dancing in the air. The radiator clicked through its peaceful, familiar cycle. When the knock came, Chloe scurried across the floor to open it. Juliana stood on the threshold, wearing a soft, cream-colored wool sweater and dark trousers, her hair falling naturally around her shoulders instead of its usual rigid knot. She looked younger, lighter, as if the suffocating weight of her corporate crown had finally been lifted. "Hi, Juliana," Chloe said, a bright, welcoming smile breaking across her face. "Did you bring the drawing back?" "I did," Juliana said, stepping into the apartment and handing a neatly framed piece of paper to the little girl. It was the crayon sketch of the 3 figures sitting under the yellow light. I thought it deserved a proper frame. Chloe beamed, running off to place it on her bedside table. Juliana walked into the kitchen, setting a thick leather folder on the wooden table beside the apple wedges. Garrett set his knife down, looking at the folder, then up at her with his steady, distant gray eyes. "The board officially ratified the settlement this morning," Juliana said, her voice dropping into a quiet, intimate register. "The equity transfer is complete. You are technically one of the largest independent shareholders of Meridian Aerospace, Garrett. The executive suite is waiting for you if you want it. The chief technology officer position is yours by right." Garrett looked out the window, watching the winter light trace the snow-covered roofs of the neighborhood. He didn't look like a man who had just inherited a fortune. He looked exactly the same as he had when he was earning an hourly wage in Hangar 9. "I don't belong in a glass tower, Juliana," Garrett said softly, his voice a low, masculine comfort that seemed to instantly ground her. "Elena and I built the code because we loved the mathematics of flight. We didn't build it for the titles. I like the quiet here. I like being the person who walks Chloe to the bus stop at 8:15 every morning without needing an executive assistant to clear my schedule." Juliana smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached her eyes. She felt a profound sense of relief washing over her. "I knew you'd say that." Which is why the board also approved a secondary directive, You are now the senior architecture consultant. You work from wherever you want, whenever you want, and your only responsibility is to ensure our systems remain safe. Garrett looked at her for a long moment, a slow, incredibly warm smile finally breaking through his quiet reserve. It was a look that belonged entirely to her. I think I can manage that. Chloe came back into the kitchen, grabbing an apple wedge and looking between the two adults with her wide, intuitive eyes. She slid her small hand into Juliana's palm, finding it warm this time. Are you staying for dinner tonight, Juliana? Chloe asked directly. Dad is making pot roast. Juliana looked up at Garrett. The space between them was no longer filled with corporate tension, public humiliation, or hidden identities. It was filled with a rare, beautiful certainty, a quiet understanding that had grown naturally through crisis and care. Garrett met her gaze, his steady gray eyes offering her a silent, protective welcome that promised the one thing her wealth could never buy: absolute safety. She's staying, Chloe, Garrett said quietly, his voice filled with a gentle, hopeful promise for the future. She's staying as long as she likes. Outside the window, the winter snow fell softly against the glass, slow and unhurried, settling over the world with a patience that suggested the storm had finally passed, and the real story was finally beginning.